Uh, Good afternoon. I'm Helen Phelan, one of the co-founders of the Deccan Heritage Foundation, and I would like to welcome you all to the fourth webinar since 2021, when I think we started. During the COVID lockdown, we initiated a series of webinars in the hope of introducing the rich heritage of this region of the Deccan to a wider public. Initially, these events were a collaboration between the DHF, the Centre for Islamic Studies in Cambridge, and the Vodaya Foundation of Mysore. After 3 seasons of successful webinars presented by specialists in different fields of Deccani culture and attended by interested parties around the globe, we are launching today our 4th webinar. And I'm very happy to welcome Marika Sardar, a colleague and someone both Vivek and I have great admiration for, is participating in organizing this 4th webinar season. I would also like to thank Niels Cunningham, who has been supportive since the very beginning, as well as Srikara Dattatreya, the administrator of the Deccan Heritage Foundation, for making sure that everything works properly. Without them, I don't think we would have had such wonderful webinars. So as you're not here to listen to what I have to say, but to our authors, I would like to ask Marika Sardar to present the lectures of this first session of the 4th webinar, and hope to see you in the coming ones as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen, for starting off the program, and thank you and Vivek for inviting me to join in this 4th session of the Deccan webinars. They've been immensely successful. I've enjoyed listening to the papers, and the audiences you've been able to draw on are really impressive. So today it's my pleasure to start off the 4th session here with 2 speakers who worked on an exhibition that was held here in Toronto, where I'm based, at the Royal Ontario Museum. It was called The Cloth That Changed the World, and it was based on the fantastic Kalamkari collection that the ROM holds, but also brought in many new acquisitions, as well as other loans and contemporary works as well. So it's my pleasure to have Sarah Fee, who is the organizing curator for that project, as well as one of the people who contributed to the catalog, Rajarshi Sengupta, speak to you all this morning, presenting that exhibition and the research that went into it. Sarah Fee is Senior Curator of Global Fashion and Textiles at the ROM, and she teaches in the Art History Department at the University of Toronto. She holds graduate degrees in Anthropology and African Studies from Oxford University and INALCO in Paris, and her research and publications focus on textile making, gifting, and trading in Madagascar and the wider Indian Ocean world. Rajarshi Sengupta is a practitioner and art historian, presently teaching at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the IIT Kanpur. And he completed his PhD in art history from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver in 2019, and received the iArts Textiles of India grant to study at the Royal Ontario Museum collections in 2017 to 18. And he also contributed, as I mentioned, to the catalog of The Cloth That Changed the World. And he's currently working on an edited book on Deccani material culture with Dr. Baishali Ghosh. So for this audience in particular is something that we are looking forward to seeing in print. So with that, I'd like to turn over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marika, for that kind introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen then. And Here we go. Unless I hear otherwise, I will assume that the share has worked.
You're all good.
Oh, good. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And it's a real pleasure to be addressing your group. And also, of course, having so many people from around the world. So I'm glad the time was organized so we could capture as many people as possible. So as mentioned, Dr. Sengupta and I will be sharing this talk entitled Cloth That Changed the World, Histories and Contemporaneity of Kalamkari Making. So I'm going to be talking mainly about the historic aspects of this unique South Asian textile tradition. And then Rajarshi will be delving deeply into one particular tradition, region, and practitioner. So I myself work mainly on the textile traditions of Eastern Africa and Madagascar. And it was actually rather late in life, really in the past 6 years, that I came to think about and work on Indian textiles. In that regard, it is mainly about the central role of Indian trade textiles in the Western Indian Ocean. So these are the textiles woven and printed, cotton and silk, made really primarily in Gujarat for export to Zanzibar, Somalia, and Madagascar. So it's really Western India that I know better. But what brought me to the textiles of the Coromandel coast was the preparation of the exhibition Cloth That Changed the World that Marika just mentioned, India's painted and printed cottons. And I was the lead curator of this exhibition, held at our museum, the Royal Ontario Museum, from 2020 to 2021. I really hope some of you were able to see it because of COVID. It opened and closed several times, but I have the good news to share that it's going to be traveling this fall to the St. Louis Art Museum. So here are just a few overviews of the exhibition, and I'm going to be returning to some of these pieces later in the talk. So the exhibit featured over 80 objects, painted and printed cottons made in Gujarat, Rajasthan, and the Coromandel coast. These, of course, are the three main areas that historically produced printed and painted cottons. And nearly all of the pieces that we show were made for export, made in India for export to markets around the world, to Thailand, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Iran, Japan, Egypt, and of course, Europe. And most of these objects came from the ROM's own collection. The majority were acquired, actually, originally collected by Harry Wern, who was a British designer of textiles and wallpapers. And like many Victorian European designers, Wern put together a collection of Asian textiles to inspire his own creations, one of which you see paired with him. And you can see what the inspiration might have been. So altogether, Wern collected around 80 Indian painted and printed cottons from the Coromandel coast, mainly from the 18th century, and he donated these to the ROM in 1934. Now, the ROM Wern collection combined with the V&A collection was displayed together in Toronto in 1970 in the famous Origins of Chintz exhibition, which was a pioneering step in the study of these textiles. And it led to the accompanying catalog, The Origins of Chintz, where John Irwin and Catherine Brett recorded a lot of information that we still rely on today in terms of Coromandel textiles. In 1970, of course, was a long time ago, and in the interim, we at the ROM have acquired many other pieces, and of course, scholarship has also expanded, so it was time to do a new exhibition. So our own exhibition, The Cloth That Changed the World, sought to tell the full global story of Indian painted and printed cottons, not just the pieces made for export to Europe that featured in Origins of Chintz, but those from across time and space, not just the 18th century, but going back to medieval times and through to contemporary times. Pieces made for all the markets for Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. But telling this really big story, of course, took also a really big team. and in fact, a multidisciplinary team of art historians, we had economic historians, anthropologists, and artists. And in all of this, I really consider myself the coordinator or editor of this project. We invited in and drew on many experts, and you can see some of them here at our workshop at the ROM in 2018. They included Rosemary Krill, Ruth Barnes, Ilanit Edwards, Sylvia Houdeling, Rajarshi Sengupta, plus our own ROM curator of South Asia, Dipali Dewan. Not pictured are many other authors, such as Giorgio Riello and the artist Renuka Reddy. Now, we all got along, I think, really quite well, despite our different disciplines and approaches, but there was one small hang-up, and that was what to call these painted and printed cottons. And we never really quite resolved it. Some people preferred the term kalamkari to speak of the printed pieces. I myself chose to use the term chintz to cover both printed and painted, and I'll explain the difference in a minute here. So mostly in my presentation, I will be referring to these painted and printed cottons as chintz, even though the title of our talk is kalamkari, and I believe Dr. Sengupta will be using that term. So what are the painted and printed cottons of India, or chintz, or kalamkari? The key message here is that cotton is in fact really difficult to dye with natural dyes. We take it for granted today that it's easy, but in fact, in the past, using natural dyes, it was really complicated. And probably several thousand years ago, artisans in India perfected the techniques to do this. They apply dye agents known as mordants to attract dyes, or they apply resists, such as wax or mud, to resist the dyes or repel them when they're placed in the dye bath. And Indian artisans historically applied both these mordants and these resists in two very different ways. In the upper left, you can see the bamboo pen or the column. So that is used to hand draw designs on for the mordants and the resists. And in the lower left, you see the other way you can do this, and that's using carved wooden blocks to apply these same substances. So again, the key takeaway is that the cloth, after you've applied these, must then be immersed into these dye baths, which you see in the middle, into this indigo dye bath, or into these heated red dye baths. So the cloth, the cotton must be able to withstand beatings, washings, scrubbings, bleaching in the sun, dipping. It takes a lot of stress, the cloth. So the cotton cloth is as important. And it could take 12 artisans and something like 6 months maybe to produce a piece like you see on the right, which is a large wall hanging made for export to Europe in the 18th century. I won't spend a lot of time here, but just to stress again the difficulty of doing this, here are just some of the very basic steps, which would be first to draw on black outlines using an iron mordant. You would draw on red outlines using an alum mordant. Purple, these light purple, is a combination of alum and iron. You'll need to steep it then in a hot red dye bath for the colors to appear. Then you need to draw fine lines with wax to resist. To get these small areas of blue, it's the same thing. You actually have to cover all of it that you don't want to be blue with a wax to resist it. We have our indigo dye bath. Finally, you're going to hand paint directly yellow, usually turmeric, onto the surface to get your green or yellow, and then gilding, as in this piece. Now, I'm sorry for the, the bad map here, but you can see in the upper left, these areas along the Coromandel coast that were famous for producing these painted cottons. And on the right, you can see what was one of the magic or the secret weapons of the Coromandel coast, and that's the chayavar plant, Oldenlandia undulata, which is indigenous, endemic to southern India and to Sri Lanka, and it gives that really bluish red that was, inimitable elsewhere in the world, and even unavailable largely in Gujarat and other areas. So those were the secret weapons, this column painting in this red with Coromandel Coast. So it was using these same techniques that I've just walked through that India made, that the Coromandel Coast in particular made all of these different textiles that you see here for these different global markets. So these artists were not only masters of color, they were also masters of design in being able to create these very different designs and patterns for these different markets, ranging from, you see on the far left, this very bold sunburst, very bold and austere compared to the intricacies of what was preferred in Sri Lanka or Thailand. And a large part of our exhibition explores all of these various global desires. We hope that we have, succeeded in sharing the great size, scale, and design variety, including these tiny, what you see in the middle, these pieces that would have been transferred in Japan into these tea ceremony objects. They are tiny, they're only measuring about 3 inches high, and showing the aesthetics of what the Japanese market preferred. Now, as mentioned, it was really the Coromandel Coast that came to specialize in using the column pen. Gujarat, as we know, did apply these substances using the column pen in medieval times. So our fragment that you see at the top that was found in Egypt was made using the column pen. But sometime in the early modern times, using the column pen really declined and disappeared from Gujarat, whereas it became the specialty of Coromandel Coast. So you can say in some ways it was really the Coromandel Coast that changed the world by creating these designs that were desired around the world. And I'll come back to that in just a little bit. And of course, they were producing pieces for export to Europe. By 1650, the East India companies were making more money by taking Indian cottons back to Europe than they were making by transporting spices, and they switched to this Indian cotton textile trade. The multiplication of European factories or forts along the Coromandel Coast at this time were largely in order to procure this chintz cloth. But our exhibition opened not with export pieces and not with a ROM piece either, but instead we wished to feature from the very beginning India. The first section, emphasizes and explores the deep historic roots of India's own patronage of painted and printed cottons. That is what was made in India for India's own consumers, for the court, countryside, and temples. And we were very honored to show for the first time ever one panel from a formerly unknown set of 17th century Coromandel painted cottons. The piece that you see here was the one that we ended up displaying. And here it is in its full length at the top. The one that you see in the lower right is what featured in the catalog. So they come from a set of 9 panels that together measured over 30 meters long. All depict secular court scenes from a Nayaka court of Tamil Nadu. Each such as the processions you see in these 2 pieces. Horses that appeared in the catalog in the lower right, or seated on an elephant in the upper piece. He is attended by courtiers and watched by women from niches above. Now, Rosemary Krill wrote on these hangings for our catalog, and since she has written for Halley magazine for the spring 2020 edition, where she goes into great depth discussing the importance of the discovery of these pieces. She also has given a lecture on YouTube. I put the link there at the bottom if you are interested. Now, she has called the discovery of the set a major event in the field. The panels were with a French family from the 17th or 18th century until very recently. The architectural details, the dress details, and activities portrayed all point to depicting Nayaka court. Her best guess is Tirumal Nayak of Madurai, but it could have been a ruler of Tanjavur. These same features point to a likely date of the mid-17th century, probably around 1640, and this has been confirmed by C14 dating. And although made for a ruler of Tamil Nadu, it is unlikely that the pieces themselves were made in Madurai, but more likely come from either Pulicat or Nagapattinam. These are where Maribel Gittinger and John Irwin first suggested that these types of secular Hindu hangings were made. You know, it's exceptionally rare. Only a few dozen of these pieces are known. And as Rosemary says, the quality is exceptional, you know, both the drawing and the dyeing. And of course, what is above all exceptional is the condition. All of the colors are intact, including yellows, which tend to disappear first. Now, quickly, I just want to share two other rare or important Coromandel chintz that are in the exhibit. First is our rare 18th century warrior's jacket made for the court of Thailand for the royal bodyguard, which you can see in the illustration on the right. You have the ruler seated on an elephant and his royal bodyguard marching before him. Now, it is the only surviving Thai warrior's jacket outside of Thailand, and it would have been commissioned by the king himself, who annually sent agents to the Coromandel coast to purchase chintz items made to his specifications. I understand that for the coronation of the most recent Thai king, which was a few years ago, he dispatched people to the Coromandel coast to again obtain these important ritual textiles that were necessary for the coronation. So the Thai jacket it's painted to shape. On the front and on the shoulders and back, we have a ferocious fanged demon face, and the body of it is drawn with what scholars believe is chainmail. I also want to show these two pieces that we showed in the exhibition, which were made for the Iranian market. Now, for many people, these are not the technically finest, but what is important to them, to me anyway, is their date, which is the 19th century. There's this common idea that due to the Industrial Revolution and the production of printed cottons in Europe, that the Indian production was wiped out. But we know that in the 19th century, on the Coromandel coast, artisans continued to make pieces for export, especially to Iran, also to Southeast Asia, and it continued to Africa as well. So these are survivors that point to this from the 19th century of this ongoing trade. And for any graduate student looking for a topic, many of the workshops have been printed onto these pieces. So tracing their creation and distribution in the 19th century could still be recaptured. They also still use the technique of wax resist. So that is also why I love these pieces. Now, I will just quickly walk you through a very complicated topic before I close my part of the presentation. But since I am talking about the historical dimension of this, and as I mentioned, one might be able to say that it was the Coromandel coast that changed the world. Now, because Indian chintz was desired in so many global markets, it's not surprising that other people wanted to emulate and imitate it. So the fourth part of our exhibit tackles this part of world history, and it's what we call changing the world or the consequences of desire. So basically, this came in three keys. The first way that Indian chintz changed the world was to spark the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Indian cottons were so profitable, as I mentioned, that from the early 1600s, Europeans are imitating them. Partly they spied on techniques in India, partly they brought Armenian craftsmen to teach them. And it actually took them hundreds of years to master these complicated dyes and printing processes. But from around 1770, Britain is able to overtake India as the world's biggest producer. And yet it still relied on getting the cotton base for its printing from India. So to overcome this, British entrepreneurs, they mechanized cotton cloth spinning and then weaving. And then the rest becomes history. But they, in turn, of course, do not have cotton, and they rely on cotton imports from the US. And this intensifies slavery, the enslavement of Africans and transport to the US for the growing of cotton. And we are left today with the ramifications of all of this. Finally, the British are able, through their political and economic control, able to basically displace India's own cottons, their printed cottons, with their industrial imitations. But that happily is not the end of our story. Craft activists in India and practitioners kept the knowledge, skills, and torch going against all odds into the 20th century, so that today painting and printing cotton continues in Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Andhra Pradesh, as well as Tamil Nadu. So that is where we end our exhibit. It is in showing some of these contemporary fashions and interior furnishings that are still being made. And in fact, there's been a whole renaissance. We featured this tunic and shoes from 1111, fashion firm based in New Delhi. They commissioned women in Srikalahasti to paint these fashion garments that were a real success for this company. And thanks to Rajarshi Sengupta, we were able to commission this exquisite sari from Kailasham, who was born in Srikalahasti, but is today active in Hyderabad. And he created this sari for us with scenes from the Ramayana. And I think you can see in it, and I hope you can see, the exquisite detail, hand skills, expression, vibrancy that is still alive in hand painting cottons along the Coromandel coast and in the Deccan today. Just exquisite detail in the forest, the animals, the people that you can see here. So with that, and having moved into contemporary, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn the talk over to Dr. Sengupta.
Thank you, Sarah. Rajarshi?
Yes, please. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Thank you very much. And thanks, first of all, of course, that before I forget, thanks very much to Deccan Heritage Foundation, Centre for Islamic Studies, University of Cambridge, and the Bangalore International Centre for setting us this platform so that we could share all our interest and, of course, have the space for discussion on this issue in the future. And of course, thanks very much to Dr. Fee, because some of the issues that those were brought up here, and of course that the way you have introduced and given some of the specific details of the making of the textiles, as well as their specificity in terms of the size and the technical details, they add a lot to our understanding, as well as it becomes much easier for me to continue this conversation now. So I'd start my presentation, and my focus, as Dr. P had already stated it, that my focus is going to be mostly in the Coromandel region, as well as a very specific area, that is Polavaram, and that is close to this historic site of Mashipatnam. So let me just begin with giving a bit on Kalamkari and get to the further points. The practice of Kalamkari making in the coastal Coromandel and the Deccan relied on the abilities of artisans from not only one but many sectors of textile making, such as woodblock making, dye painting, printing, and resist dye drawing. Thus, this collaborative practice simultaneously functioned as a melting pot of intercultural knowledge and artisanal skills of different sectors. So Kalamkari is predominantly practiced and flourished along the Coromandel coastline, starting from as north as the Godavari Delta and to the southmost part of the Indian Peninsula. For my research, I focused on the Northern Coromandel and the Deccan because of the handful of the sites that continue to produce the highly specialized textiles. For example, Pedana, Polavaram, Srikalahasti, and Hyderabad, all are located there. In this presentation, I'll focus on the dyeing and printing activities at Polavaram near Machilipatnam, especially a set of large hangings by the late master dyer Nageswara Rao to emphasize the spirit of border crossing embedded in this historic textile from this region.
Rajarshi, can we ask you to speak a bit louder, please? Some people are struggling to hear you.
Can you hear me properly now?
If you can get any louder,
Yes,
Okay.
you seem fine. Yeah.
All right, all right. Okay. The long coastline of Coromandel is broadly divided into northern and southern Coromandel regions and near the confluence of the Krishna River at the Bay of Bengal. And Machilipatnam is very close to this Krishna Delta. Polavaram is located near the Delta of Krishna. The way to Polavaram from the historic port town of Machilipatnam is accompanied by vast green fields and several canals feeding the agricultural lands. However, the drinking water is not fetched from these canals because of its proximity to the sea. Salt water often flows into the canal during flood tides, which makes it unsuitable for drinking. Polavaram is situated at a short distance from Ghantasala, a site of a 2nd century Buddhist stupa, and Srikakulam on the banks of the river Krishna. The Srikakulam temple, dedicated to Andhra Vishnu, is believed to have existed for centuries. And after its mention in the early modern Vijayanagara ruler Krishnadeva Raya's literary work Amukta Malyada, this site has gained even more historical importance. Numerous waterways allowed the transmission of objects, people, and knowledge in and out of this region. The sedimented histories of the Coromandel indicate an entanglement of ecological, social, and cultural aspects, which are also reflected in the dyed textiles in this region. This riverine land and the availability of water in this region has a deep impact on the preparation and application of the colors on textiles. Organic textile dyes all are water soluble, and the process of dyeing requires ready availability of water. The presence of canals at Gulapura and Polavaram area is a great support for the local dyeing activities. Now, the first half of the 20th century saw a decline of Kalamkari making in Machilipatnam. And thanks to Dr. Fee, because she brought this up, that how the Persian merchants and of course, like, I should say the Iranian merchants and then the people from Northern Africa and part of Southeast Asia, they were still the consumers of the Kalamkari fabrics in the 19th century. And as scholar Lotika Varadarajan, she puts forward that one of the prime reasons for decline in the Machilipatnam this textile industry of Kalamkari was the lack of patronage from the Iranian buyers. This region was active in the anti-colonial movement and was one of the most well-known freedom fighters. Pingali Venkaya from Machilipatnam went on to design the tricolor flag of the Indian nation state. Various initiatives to revitalize craft making in the 1950s by the newly formed Indian government, including the establishment of the All India Handicrafts Board, or AIHB, in 1952, to the Weaver Service Center in 1956, fueled the demand for extensive documentation of the maker communities. This was taken further by the 1961 Census of India, which presented a rigorous and painstaking documentation of the existing crafts community across the nation. Emphasis on the hereditary artisans and community-bound occupations was established in the 1961 Census of India. Understandably, for the documentation purpose, the reports highlighted the master artisans with specialized skill sets. Framing craftspeople from a traditionalist point of view in the governmental ventures since the 1950s resulted in equating craft practice with generational, homogeneous, and single occupational groups, making inadequate room for fluidity. The fixation on a site and authority to punctuate authenticity as delineated by the geographical indication or GI tend to overlook craft makers' net relationship with localized knowledge structures and their affective ties in quotes to other producer communities. So here we have images from this this site from the Census of India, and here we have the site of Machilipatnam town that was featured in this 1961 census, and then very important figure here in the right, that is V. Venkataswamy Naidu. So one of the handful of the natural dye printers during the survey done for the 1961 census in the Machilipatnam area was V. Venkataswamy Naidu, and he is presented here with the characteristic Machilipatnam style mehrab hanging. So this hanging, I believe that Dr. Fee had already shown it for the Iranian market, and you can see that, I mean, this hanging is still there that was continued to be produced in the 1950s as well. So these textiles used as bedspreads as well as cartons feature a prominent cypress motif above a stylized Deccan rock formation, framed with an arched gateway and a series of borders. In this one, a block printed Shiva Nataraja image also appears in the continuous borders. So you can see that, I mean, of course, I mean, he had guarded the central motif, but there will be a one big cypress motif flanked by two other smaller ones. And then here are those Shiva Nataraja images, which are used here as a border, which I believe it was a decision made by the artisan. Now, possibly in the 1960s, Nageswara Rao, a descendant from the Devanga weaver community, developed his interest in natural dyeing and printing from Venkataswamy Naidu and set up, and he learned this from Venkataswamy Naidu and set up a dyeing workshop in Polavaram. So Polavaram was already a busy weaving center when Rao established his workshop. With his son, the late master dyer Mukantishwara Rao, of course, they could succeed this dyeing workshop and keep continuing to produce printed fabrics from this site. So during my visits in 2015, 2017, and 2019, I found dye printing and weaving simultaneously being practiced. So the images that we have on screen, this is happening exactly outside of the printing workshop of Mukanteshwar Rao, and this is happening inside of the printing workshop. So all these practices go almost hand in hand in this area. And some of the family members of Rao, they still practice spinning and weaving even today. So the dyeing workshop consists several sections: the printing unit, storage of dyes and wood blocks, and boiling and washing units. Apart from that, as I have mentioned before as well, that open space for drying fabrics under the tropical sun and proximity to the local water sources are also essential. Now, during the preparation for the Festival of India in Britain in 1982, and the Vishwakarma exhibitions, it was a decade-long project that started from 1981 and continued until 1991, initiated by textile scholar and conservationist Martand Singh and Kukul Jacker. Of course, she does not need an introduction because she is this prolific craft activist. So they have organized this month-long training program that was conducted in this very workshop that was established by Nageswara Rao. The program brought Rao and the fellow dyers and printers from this region into conversation with textile scholars and designers. This perhaps for the first time provided Nageswara Rao an access to the reproduction of the historic kalamkaris from the museum collections in India and beyond. Primarily printed textiles were produced during the program, and two quintessential Machilipatnam types, Mehrab and Konya Chakra textiles, were featured in the in the Festival of India 1982. So we have this Konya Chakra piece, which is perhaps the same one that we see in the catalog of this 1982 exhibition. So this one is a scanned image from the catalog, and this is the this Konya Chakra that they have in their workshop today. So it is possibly the same fabric, or since it is a printed material, so there are editions those were created during that time as well. So it was supervised by Nageswara Rao, and Konya Chakra is a square piece of fabric that features thick bands of continuous borders defining the image area. Framed within the borders, an image filled with continuous creepers and floral patterns is seen. At the center, a full-bloom flower with 8 petals, perhaps resonating the highly significant octagonal form in the Deccan, is featured. And of course, I mean, when I think about the octagonal forms, I mean, I cannot ignore how like the hushed plan for making the buildings for the ground plan, and of course the octagonal basins were featured in many Deccan sites, I mean the historic sites. So here the central motif is constructed from 4 units, and they are repeated in each corner. So in this image you can see that, I mean, the units which are repeated in each corner, they are brought together to make this central pan, this central flower. So that is the reason this is called Konya Chakra. The precision of measurement to ensure the coordination between the block prints is matched by the sound knowledge of using stencils in this piece. This experimentations and exploration prompted Nageswara Rao to assimilate printing, stenciling, and drawing to produce a set of large hangings based on Hindu and Buddhist themes. Only in one hanging, freehand drawing is incorporated, and in the other, stencil drawings are employed to execute the central figures. And I'm thankful to Nageswara Rao's grandson, whose name is also Nageswara Rao, named after his grandfather, for familiarizing me with this set of textiles as well as providing me information on them. So Nageswara Rao Jr. also assumed that, I mean, this hanging, the one we have on screen, is fully made of block printing. But by that, what I think he meant was no freehand drawing was used there. Why these hangings were not part of the exhibition in 1982 or later remains unknown, but one wonders if this use of drawing limited the scopes to assess the artisans who were already recognized as printers by the governmental measures. The Vishwakarma exhibitions featured column-drawn kalamkaris from Srikalahasti and Hyderabad by the late J. Gurapachetti and M. Kailasham. One of his textiles was also featured in the Cloth That Changed the World. However, their hangings stood strikingly different from the ones produced by Rao, perhaps because of Rao's close affinity with printing. Rao displayed a mindful and masterful utilization of woodblocks from his collection to construct the picture plane. For that, many of the visual motifs in the utilitarian textiles were refurbished in these hangings. One of the prominent example will perhaps be the cypress motif, which the contemporary block carvers of Pedana identify as Dhuni Stambham or incense burner. Similar blocks to the cypress motif in the Mehrab textile, the cypress motifs used in this Mehrab textile, and that was featured in this textile, the Master Weaver or the Festival of India exhibition in 1982, the one we have on screen here in the left side. So the similar ones which were used there was used in utilizing the hanging for making the trees in the background. So this is the hanging that was produced by Rao. And of course, I mean, you have seen this image in the poster as well. So this is the same cypress motif that we see that is featured here. So that is refurbished in this hanging to have a sense of this, these trees in the landscape. So here, what we also find that, I mean, how with the cypress motif, that there are of course that there are the column drawers of the Srikalahasti. They emphasize the freehand drawing, and the die printers. They sort of like make use of this printed images, as well as the stencil drawing, which goes strikingly different from the ones which are produced in Srikalahasti. And by that, what happens that we find that whereas the prominent painters in Srikalahasti today, they rely on this term like freehand drawing, as I have spoke to Jegura Pachetti and some of the other people. The printers, they rely on the repository of their images. And one of the repository that we see here, that is the repository of the woodblocks. So they keep the woodblocks, those were collected from many different sources over the last 40 years or so, and they refurbish them, they use them, they renew them with every use that they do. The image of the Krishna under the Kadamba tree, flanked by two Sakhis, draws the herds of the cows as well as the repeated elephant motifs to the center. The rushing cows are stencil drawn, similar to that of the central image, that is of Krishna and the Kadamba tree, whereas the Sakhis are printed from the same set of blocks. We see these are the Sakhis who are also represented here. The plateau-like suggestion in the background seems to draw from the Deccan rock formation. So here we see a slight suggestion of this landscape, which looks triangular here. So basically, this is the plateau-like landscape that is suggested here. And if we compare that to the Mehrab hanging, we also see this triangular stylized Deccan rock formation there. And that is also something that is imbibed here in this hanging as well, with this cypress motif. So this is, as I have said, that another hanging also have this similar kind of compositional arrangement. And that another hanging that presents Buddha meditating under a tree. Possibly the stencil for the Kadamba tree with the peacock that we have seen in the earlier image is repeated here. Whereas the earlier hanging does not display a sharp color division between the borders and the image area within, this hanging implements this strategy that adds to the monumentality of the Buddha figure and imbibes the meditative stillness in the entire image. The bold, dark contour lines defining the form of Buddha and the tree became a characteristic of the Kalamkaris in the 20th century. I read this emergence of black to mark the outlines of the forms on textiles is perhaps the dyer's choice to establish their position in this contemporary market system. Crisp black outlines readily draw viewers' attention to these textiles. During the post-independence time, the dyers had to assert their presence in the rapidly mechanized textile sectors. The dark, pronounced outlines as the artisanal decisions to respond to this socioeconomic situation. The outlines are drawn in black and brown. With the presence of sharp outlines, the figures and the forms in Rao's work are bold and robust. The muted block prints depicting a landscape in the background enhances the presence of the central figures. The printed background features domed and towered architectural structures, humans, animals, and plants. Except for this hanging, script is usually not featured in this, in all the hangings those are produced by Rao. The script describes the narrative scene, but does not provide any information about the maker. Text and images are often featured in the narrative temple hangings of Srikalahasti, where text panels run simultaneously with the visuals. Here, a concise description at the left and right corners and the title at the center seem to follow the calendar and popular prints instead of going back to the Srikalahasti tradition. This hanging, from which we saw the detail, titled Sandhya Tando, shows Shiva performing the Tandava dance in a palatial setting where Parvati is seated on a simhasana or lion throne accompanied by other gods and goddesses from the Hindu pantheon. The graphic quality of the visuals, precision of lines, and the use of complementary colors also evoke his affinity to printing. To sum up, I'll suggest that Nageswara Rao's practice was deeply embedded in the skill set of printing and he approached painting through his established knowledge base. His practice on one hand drew from the historic Kalamkaris that featured painting, printing, and wax resist in the same textile. So bringing multiple medium together in one piece. On the other, it moved away from the Srikalahasti style of Kalamkari making to announce its distinctive character. The experiments of Rao were short-lived, though they resonate with the ambitions of the historic Kalamkari makers who moved beyond single occupational category. Today, the Mehrab textiles are still produced in the Polavaram workshop. However, if gold paint is added to these textiles, local sign and banner painters and the painters who draw the truck or paint the truck with brilliant, beautiful colors are called to perform this job. The printers and dyers do not participate in this job anymore today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajarshi, for that fantastic lecture. I think, Sarah, if you'd like to share your screen, just gonna add a pin. I think we have a first question already from Dr. Marika Sardar, who kindly invited you to our webinar. So Marika, go ahead.
Thank you so much for your presentations. And I did have questions for each of you, if I may take my privilege as a moderator to jump in first here. And I just wanted to say, I was one of the few who were able to see the exhibition in Toronto and actually go back several times over the course of the year that it was opening and closing at the RAM. And it was, you know, a fantastic experience, and it's so different to see these textiles in person, and especially the Palampur that you had opening the exhibitions there. Just at certain angles you could catch the gold on it, and it was really makes you stop in your tracks as you sort of entered the exhibition. And I wanted to ask you in particular about some of the new material that you brought to the exhibition. As you explained, it sort of was based in this historical donation from Harry Wern, but not only was there the textile that you mentioned that was recently discovered, the Nayaka one, but I know that you also made several acquisitions, if I read the labels correctly, and noticing the dates that things had entered the RAM collection. And I was wondering if you could speak to some of those and how they maybe changed our understanding of this period. We've been, as I said, based on a set of textiles we've known since about the 50s and really published by John Irwin and so on, but now we're adding to the corpus, I think, after a long gap.
Thank you for that, Marika, and I'm so glad that you were able to get it. And you know, you and I have never even had a chance to really talk about this, so I might turn the question back on you when I'm done answering a bit. So in terms of, you know, there on the one hand there was expanding the RAM's collection, which in some ways added to the scholarly fields. You know, in 1978, we took in this Abameyer collection of over 1,000 pieces from the Michael Abameyer, who is based in Cairo, and that included some of these Indo-Egyptian fragments. So our collection is about 23 that we acquired in 1978. So this came after the Origins of Jin's exhibition. So that expanded our collection to go into the medieval times. And for anyone interested, Ruth Barnes published an article on our Indo-Egyptian collection in Textile History in 2017. So, you know, it's a small collection in terms of the world collection, but it still did add new examples, especially of painted pieces. Again, going back to this idea that Gujarat did have traditions of painting of column work, not just printing. And then our Thai jacket only came in the 1980s. And as I mentioned in the talk, that this has added to the corpus of what is known to have been made, you know, specifically in terms of, you know, tailored dress for Southeast Asia. And then coming to the piece that I spent some time talking about, this loan from Paris, from the private collection. from Rajarshi of Paris of these 9 panels. That I think, was our biggest contribution, that this was their debut. And I would actually like to hear your take on this. I guess what it did there is it increased the number. There's probably a dozen of 17th century pieces that have been known. So this added 9. There is this idea that they might have all been joined at one point and then cut up to fit this French chateau where they were for these hundreds of years. So it added, in terms of number, it added a substantial number. And I think in terms of the condition, it allows us to see the splendor of what these would have looked like, because so many of what we have are faded or tattered. In terms of the care, and I think also showing just the sophistication of and importance and beauty of what was made in India for India, because we focus so much on the global market, that this, I think, makes a contribution in that way. But I would love to hear your insights.
Yeah, I also just want to add, I would love to hear Marika's insights as well, given her role on Interwoven Globe, the major exhibition at the Met, as well as the textile section of the Deccan exhibition, as well as other larger textile shows, such as Fabric of India at the V&A. So it'd just be really interesting to hear your viewpoint on this, Marika.
You're on the spot.
I know, I was going to say, this isn't fair. I was just coming in to make the introductions and ask some questions. And I know that there are other people who are in this, I believe both Sylvia and Rosemary are on the call this morning. But I think in addition to the things you mentioned, just having these long stretches of textile and, where we are used to seeing fragments of things cut up for the art market, I think that helps us understand where those small pieces that we have in museum collections could fit into these longer compositions and how the figures are interacting with each other and so on. But then also it changes how we think they might have been displayed. I think that's still, what we're coming around to having to understand. If they're so large in scale, then we have to rethink, where they might have been used, displayed, and also experienced when you're really enveloped in such a massive textile teeming with figures. So I don't think I have answers from this yet, but I think it opens up lots of possibilities in the way that the previously preserved things didn't. And if I may, another question, were you, since your area was originally working in Africa, were you able to find, more evidence of connections there? That's something that we don't often see in publications of these kinds of Indian textiles. Southeast Asia, Iran, Europe are well-established markets. Was there something, considering your connections there, that
I'd say
might
yes
come out in future work?
I would say yes and no. I've been for years in pursuit of any museum examples of pieces made for Zanzibar, or Mozambique, that was importing, hundreds of thousands, and Madagascar, of these Gujarat textiles, and I have only found 2 to date, 2 19th century pieces, and one of them I did publish in the catalog, and it's an example of this kisutu that is still used, is printed industrial today and imitated, but I was able to find an original Indian printed version, which helps us to understand that it was the Indian version that came first before these industrial imitations. And it looks as though it was part of a wider market made for the Southeast Asian market, so that they were, imbricated the Southeast Asian and East African production and import. And one more thing I'll say on that, and my biggest regret, honestly, running out of time to include absolutely everything, we really wanted Sub-Saharan African to be represented. So I had wanted to have an Ethiopian manuscript in the exhibition because, if Rosemary's on the call today, Rosemary and I have become involved in a project there are hundreds of Ethiopian manuscripts with fragments of textiles that we've known about, but that have not been studied. And a project by Michael Jervers is looking at picking up on the work of Richard Pankhurst from the 80s and 90s to identify them. And there are hundreds of early modern and even late medieval Indian textiles in these. So this is going to be the next big area for kind of sub-Saharan Africa, understanding the textile trades and the imports of printed cottons.
That's very exciting indeed. So I hope that we get to see that soon.
Fingers crossed.
That will be, I think, a major contribution and material we haven't really seen yet. So then for Rajarshi, I just wanted to ask, another innovative part of this exhibition was how it brought in sort of 20th century production. And it was very interesting to hear the story of Nageswara Rao. And, just to step back a little bit, you mentioned how he became involved in the Festival of India. And I just as a side note, think it's interesting then how that workshop you mentioned working with scholars then brought in a new set of motifs based on the historical kalamkaris, but since before we are used to thinking about the different markets affecting motifs and designs and so on. But I was just wondering, prior to that, sort of who was the market that he was working for? How did he really come to the attention of the Festival of India organizers in the first place? Who was he producing for prior to that time?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And of course, that as far as I understand, that what happened was during the documentation for the census. So that time when V. Venkataswamy Naidu, he was held by the people who surveyed the Machilipatnam area, that the solely remaining person who was practicing natural dyes. So when Nageswara Rao sort of continued the legacy from Venkataswamy Naidu, so he sort of gained that attention from the people that, who had surveyed, and they continued to send the people for training programs and so on. So we also know that, after the census, that in the 1959, 1960, around that time, Kamladevi Chattopadhyay was herself visiting these areas. And then perhaps she also influenced that, how the printing activities, especially the ones who were focusing on natural dyes, they need to be, promoted, and the support needed for them to continue these practices can be given to them. So we believe that, even though this workshop that happened for the Festival of India by early 1980s, but this collaboration between the governmental sectors and Nageswara Rao that actually started perhaps sometimes in 1960s. So it was sort of it started and it set the stage so that, the governmental, the officials, the scholars, the designers from the weaver service centers across the country, they were confident that if they conduct this workshop in Nageswara Rao's workshop, the training program, so that will be successful. So they did their trial and error things before the 1980s, and then they arrived at this phase, and then they continued with that. So as far as Mukanteshwara Rao, late Master Dyer, he informed that, by that time, there were not too many of the domestic buyers they were interested, but only a handful of them. And slowly, with the exposure of this Festival of India, they got buyers from Japan. And some of the buyers from Japan, they still work with them. So they have very specific kind of, their demands, the color scheme, motifs, and everything, and they still continue to work with them. So that is something that we see. There's long ties they can sustain with this producer communities.
Okay, so thank you, Rajarshi. I think we have time for some more questions. If you want to put your questions in the chat box, or just or raise your hand, I'm happy to read them out or however you want to ask them. I know we have some eminent textile specialists with us, so I'm looking at you.
Rajarshi, if I can ask you a question while we're waiting for others. So with these people, these collectors based in Japan, are they continuing to collect? Are they in private collections? Are they in public museums? And have they been published?
So I don't think, they have published their stuff. And the thing is that, they're not collectors, but they actually commission running fabrics. And of course, there are some of the other things like bedspreads and stuff like that. So apparently the running fabric, then they get tailored in Japan. And then the bedspreads and stuff, of course, they are sold as they are. So they're definitely not collecting them, but they're selling them in Japan for the domestic market there. And when I remember that this one time when I was there in the workshop and they were producing some of those fabrics for this Japanese group, and when I asked that, what are the specifications and stuff, and they said that there is a strict policy that you cannot photograph them, and they're not, of course, that they were not willing to reveal much details about that. So I guess that's understandable.
I guess I have a question, and if no one else has one, I'm interested in the kinds of support, how an exhibition like The Clock That Changed the World, or even some of the other ones that have happened on the subject, how they draw attention to supporting these kinds of craft technologies and the development and preservation of them in India itself. It's amazing to see the amount of scholarship that's being done on them, but there's ways in which that scholarship can be used to sort of support local communities. And I wonder what that bridge is. That really came across as something that was kind of different about this presentation, because typically I'm accustomed to hearing about early modern kalamkari. So this was a very nice, I thought the Rajarshi, your presentation was really quite fascinating for that reason.
I guess I can just jump in and say that we made it a priority to talk about the contemporary, that was one of our major goals, and to acquire for the museum, because the prices for historic 18th century chins are astronomical. And at the same time as, investing those huge amounts, I think museums and collectors should be supporting contemporary practitioners. So we put a big part of our budget into purchasing and acquiring and making part of the permanent collection, contemporary practitioners. And we also featured artist videos, because that was one of the biggest gaps, is knowing who were the makers. So many pieces are not signed. And even when they are signed, we don't know who was signing them. To have artist videos where each artist, we had 4 artists speaking for themselves, why they do this, what this means. So that's how I think we attempted to make a contribution. But in terms of economics, the Renaissance, the local market for these products has exploded. No one needs to export anymore. Good Earth, the lines that they're carrying, 11, all these big fashion houses, the local domestic market is purchasing, just in amazing quantities, that I think that, that's going to really sustain this going forward. And I'm sure Rajarshi has much more to say.
But of course, there are 2 things I may just add. I guess one thing is certainly that, it was a really welcome move, and also that added this critical aspect to this exhibition, because it had this focus on the maker communities, and not this textile makers being unknown the way they used to be in most of these historical pieces and all. But bringing some of the people here with the videos, as well as and I believe, in some cases, acquiring of the the textiles, the way you have gone through. I mean, Sarah had gone for this long field trips, and then of course that, I mean, the interactions and everything that had been like really wonderful. I hope that there are some of the ways in which we can bring up those stories so that we know that, I mean, what all are happening behind the scene. And so in one hand, I'd say that, I mean, it was really a welcome move in many ways to incorporate the contemporary ones, so that the spirit of this experimentation that we celebrate in this historical textiles, we see that, I mean, this changes and the continuity, something that we have already been theorizing in the historical ones, is perhaps not distinct from the way we see them today. I mean, of course, like, I mean, the market system and all those things would definitely make a difference, but it's always, I mean, there are aspects in which we can find the resonance. And I'm not speaking that from a positivist point of view, but I mean, of course, that, I mean, how these two things exist simultaneously instead of, like, I mean, being binary opposites. And in terms of like the domestic market, I'd say that, I mean, there have been a number of attempts, not only just in terms of in the field of Kalamkari, but I mean, if I'm thinking some of the more practices where like Malka, like Cascom, and some of the other Deccan and South Indian foundations who have been bringing attention to like how cotton is produced, how the maker communities and all the other people need to be acknowledged in this process. So that is something that I believe that, I mean, if we continue to be aware of this, and so that will certainly going to make a difference. And as Sarah had already pointed this out, that, I mean, there is a awareness. I hope that, I mean, that goes with the knowledge about the makers as well.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any more questions, but we've had a really wonderful first webinar for this spring season. So please join me in thanking Dr. Sarah Fee and Dr. Rajarshi Sengupta for this fantastic presentation on Kalamkaris, and we all hope to visit the exhibition as it travels in North America in the coming years. So thank you so much, everybody. Our next webinar will be on April 29th. And it is delivered by Professor Karen Ruffle from the University of Toronto. Her title is The City of Hyder as a Shi'i Paradise, Divine Sovereignty, Built Space, and Shi'i Materiality in Qutub Shahi, Hyderabad. Thank you, everybody, and see you in a few weeks.